So hi everybody, I'm Rob Ong. I am a product owner also, just like Robin. I'm based here in the US. I'm on the app team, which has taken responsibility for the kind of internal offerings of applications, solutions, generic solutions that we offer to the market, as well as the kind of decomposition of those into modules that we can use, hopefully generically, to offer to our customers to incorporate into their own custom solutions. And I'm going to talk about resource management here today. It's been a kind of a hot issue or a hot topic among a lot of our customers and partners recently. I feel like probably a lot of you have already or are in the process of implementing it, perhaps in your own solutions already. But we as Shibumi have created a module around this because it's become such a hot topic of conversation. And so resource management at its core is kind of defining the capacity you have to accomplish some task, and then also defining the demand that gets registered against that capacity and kind of drawing it down and visualizing how much capacity you have. Typically, in most of our implementations of Shibumi, those resources are people. I mean, almost always it's people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, because if you abstract that sort of capacity and demand equation down, it can be things like one of my earliest customers at Shibumi actually was doing kind of capacity for vehicles and how much demand there was on the vehicles and how they could spread the capacity of the vehicles across the largest domain in order to accomplish as much as possible on a limited kind of budget of a certain number of vehicles. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people, but most often it is. So at Shibumi, the most common, sorry, this is similar slide to Robin's, just talking about what we're covering here in terms of the modules and where it fits among the larger variety of them. One of the things that we did in Shibumi that allows us to track resources, as I said, one of my early customers tracked the capacity of kind of vehicles and how they could share those. One of the, when we used to track capacity like that, we had some challenges around that because we couldn't kind of expand the scope of the things that we were trying to track the capacity of. So about 2 years ago, we introduced a new feature in Shibumi, new at the time, called associations. And associations are what let us, what allowed us to really track resources in a very dynamic and very flexible way. And so more recently, because of that, we started implementing resource management across many of our customers. And as we did that, we found that there were a lot of different ways of doing that, but we distilled it down into a very, what we think is a simple approach to doing resource management. And that's what I'm going to cover here today. So that's the module that we've distilled from that. So in a typical configuration, we have, again, we're defining the capacity for a set of resources. So we go in and we define how many, in our example here, how many people we have to fulfill, let's say, a certain role. So, and then we go off and we define for the initiatives that we're trying to accomplish. We're defining how much of those roles they need to draw down and whether or not we're meeting the demand for that capacity. So this slide here, I think, is probably the most important one. This talks about what are the different elements inside of Shibumi that we define in order to do that resource tracking. And what we've done here is we've defined a very basic set of 4 templates. Again, many of our customers have different requirements for resource tracking, so we can expand these to encompass that. That's the flexibility of Shibumi, being able to expand what we've defined. But this is the simple version that we've defined in our SPM demo and in the module. And what we're defining are kind of 4 elements. One is the resource pool, which is the group of resources that we have, project managers, developers, what have you. And then based on that, we define individual resources. So these would be the individual people who are actually fulfilling those roles. And the individual resources define the capacity for the pool. So if we have 5 program managers, project managers, let's say, then the capacity of the project manager pool is 5. And if we have a set of individual resources, what we do is we track the capacity of the individual resource, the availability of the individual resources as well. So an individual resource might be available quarter-time, part-time, half-time, full-time. And again, so based on the definition of the individual resources that we've defined, we can come up with a capacity for the entire pool. And then kind of that's defining the capacity as at a high level. Within each initiative, within each project that we're working on, we will define a set of resource demands that are drawing down on that overall capacity that we've established. And then we would tie that demand to the individual, to either the resource pool or the individual resource that we've defined. Okay. So when we start defining our overall resources, we usually do that at a macro level, so at the topmost level. Now, in some organizations, they would define resources across the entire organization, and in some, they might define the capacity at a more granular level. So they might have a program that is for, let's say, RPA resources, and they might have a set of RPA developers, and that would be separate from their cost transformation set of resources. And so that's a kind of variation, whereas in some organizations, they have a set of project managers who span the entire organization, and in that case, we would define it at the topmost level. So this is an example where at the program level, we're defining a set of resources. So these are shared resources across all the work streams and all the different efforts that are going on in the organization. And we're defining the resource pools, which are here on the left-hand side, and those are the roles, essentially, that we're supporting. And then on the right-hand side, we're defining individual resources. So these are the individual people who can fulfill those roles that we've defined on the left. And we associate them to each other. So each resource can support one resource role, one resource pool. And then we've defined, you can see down there in the availability column, we're defining how much capacity they add to that pool. And then that defines the available resources that we have here in the resource pool that defines the overall capacity for the pool. And the other thing we're seeing is in the left-hand side on the resources, in the resource pool, we're seeing how much overutilization, which is how many hours, how many units of time we have exceeded our capacity. So the ones that have no value there are managing just fine, and they're fulfilling all the planned requirements. Whereas the top four, we've sorted it that way on purpose to show us where the problems might lie. Those top four all have overages in terms of how much capacity that is being drained, is being demanded from those roles. So this is a view, again, of sort of all of the resources in the organization at the program level and their sort of availability and drawdown on capacity. So that's sort of that defines the capacity side of it. And then the next thing we do is we go over and so now we're down at an individual initiative level. And at the initiative level, we are registering our demand on that capacity. And so for each project, as you would expect, we can have multiple different roles that are going to be required to execute the initiative. And so here we have 10 different roles that are going to have to participate in order to accomplish this particular initiative. And then what we do is we define for each one the start and end dates that we need those resources to be allocated. And that would define, that would give us a sort of demand curve over time for this particular initiative. And when you roll up that demand curve for all of the different initiatives over the entire program, you can map out the demand for each one of the resource pools. This is one of the points of variation where we in our module have defined that the capacity demand, the planning side of the capacity demand, and this is typically done in the planning phase, where you're saying these are the resources that I need, and I'm going to draw them down over these periods of time, and you're doing your planning here. We're doing the planning against the resource pool, so we're doing it against a group of resources, and that sort of assumes that the resources in that pool are relatively interchangeable, right? We certainly have customers who have done a variation on that where they actually at planning time are planning on a particular person to be allocated to the project. We found more commonly that you don't know who's going to be available or who's going to be able to fulfill that. So we more often find people doing the planning side of it at the pool level, and then the actual association to an individual person would be done kind of later on in the process when they're actually trying to schedule out people's calendars and such like that. So over here, we're allocating a set of demands against the capacity pools that we have. And then the interesting part of this, the most interesting part of this, is really when you go back and look at the detailed view of the role pool, the pool of resources that we have, and you can see, based on the information that we define at the program level and at the initiative level, you can see what the demand is on a given pool over time. And here we can see at the bottom, we have these two projects, these two initiatives that have an allocation for a developer with over certain time frames. And you can see that they overlap there in the middle. And the capacity for this pool, the developer pool, just in this example, is 1. And so when we have demand for 2 different projects to have developers allocated to them, we're going to be over. And you can see in the chart above, we're showing the overages. So there's times in this chart when we don't have any demand for developers, and there's time in this chart where we have demand for just 1, and so that shows kind of a flat line on the over allocation chart. But obviously, during that overlap period, we're going to have a certain amount of time that we need the resource for extra availability. So this is kind of where the important part comes, between this view and the top level view, what we saw earlier with the overutilization number. Those are where we see all of the different elements that we've put together to track that resource capacity and that resource demand kind of comes together and shows us where we have problems. And our problems here could be solved by sliding projects out to different times, by adding additional resources, maybe outsourcing some resources. But it at least identifies for us where we have our issues. This kind of dovetails in a little bit when we start talking about scenario management, the scenario management module, that lets us do our what-if scenarios. I think you all saw that in Mark's presentation yesterday, where you can actually kind of move the allocations around in a scenario to kind of model out where your overages, your capacity overages exist. So I think, so this is the kind of overall view where we're looking at all of the demand on a particular project, and as we come around and we're actually executing our project, this is where we would say, hey, who's actually going to fulfill let's say in this case, technical architect role on this project. And you can see, if you can see, I should have circled it, but on the right-hand side in the detailed view of the allocation for this project, you can see Barry Cade has been assigned as the individual resource. So that's where you can start getting into people's actual schedules and looking at whether or not a particular person is over-allocated. And in that case, you'd be looking at a person with a capacity of one full-time or half-time resource being allocated to so many projects. So you can see the projects that they're allocated to as well. So there are, as I said, there's a number of variations on the theme of resource management. A lot of customers have done implementations in different manners. The resource management module that we provide is a relatively simple version. We didn't want to offer a complex, convoluted solution that people would then have to untangle. So we offered a relatively simple solution, but there are a lot of different aspects to resource management that kind of come into play as you implement it. And these are, the biggest one is definitely around the allocations assignment. So as I mentioned, in our module, we are allocating, in the planning process, we're allocating at the pool level. So we're not really taking into account an individual person's time at all during the planning process, because we assume that we don't know what the schedules are. Someone might leave the company or what have you, so you don't want to schedule in individual people. But we do it at the pool level. Now, if that's not how some organizations work, that they allocate people directly into the planning process and they want to manage that on a person-by-person basis, it's certainly not an issue. Shibumi could have that association assigned at the early planning level to the individual person, and we could track that person's capacity as well. Some of the other things that come along are once we have an individual person assigned to a project, how much time are they actually working on the project versus how much time was the plan for that role for the project. So there can be an element of time tracking. We actually do that internally at Shibumi. We track our own time. Again, as a resource over on a daily basis, we track our time against certain projects. So we do that. Not all of our customers do that. It's kind of something that's an option essentially for customers to use if they want to. But it's not. I'd say it's not the norm. It's just not the most common thing, because most organizations have some form of tracking of resources of time for their employees, and then we are using our resources. We track their availability in terms of in kind of broad chunks. They're either full time for a certain period of time. They're either part time for a certain amount of time. But we can certainly, both for the capacity and on the demand side, we could track down to, say, a daily level where you type in an individual number for how many hours you need for a particular person. Again, we found that that's not common. You don't usually know, especially in the planning side, you don't know what that demand is going to be any more than ballpark, quarter, half, full time. But it's certainly an option that people, Shibumi metrics can allow you to enter that information on a very granular basis. So that is, I believe, our resource management module. Question? Yes, please.
So you mentioned the quarters. Could you enter it by percentages? Is that an option? Like do a manual percentage?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep.
And then
sure.
What is the largest resource pool of individuals that people are using today?
Oh,
Are you talking hundreds?
Yeah, we've seen, so again, this is an example, right? So we have, we are tracking the individual resources, and that's how we define the capacity rolling up into a resource pool. But if we're tracking large numbers of resources, often enough, the customer won't even track those individual resources. They'll just have a pool, and they'll type in a number of how many resources they might have. So if you wanted to, you could just do it that way. You could just specify that I have a pool of developers and there's 100 of them. And we've seen that where they're registering demand against a larger pool and they're not really interested in the individuals. You could certainly do it here as well, where you would actually enter 100 individuals and with names and the dates that they're available, and that would give you that more granular visibility. But we've definitely seen people track large resource pools, but usually not at that individual level. But there's no reason why you couldn't do it that way.
I was just going to talk to that with a customer right now that's tracking over 100 resources, and they are using that percentage-based one where maybe they're 20% on this particular development platform, 50% on this.
Oh, so you're saying, yeah, so I think there's a couple answers there. So I think Ethan's describing a situation where he has individual resources who are split apart in time to fill different pools percentage-wise, right? So if someone's full-time, half their time goes to this pool, half their time goes to this pool. Was that your question, or were you asking about the demand and saying I want a 30% of a project manager?
30% of a project manager.
Yeah. Yep.
One project, 30% of
Okay.
another. But it sounds like
So,
they can do that.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
And then, I saw the start and end dates.
Yeah.
If you were to add a resource to an initiative, can you automatically default that everybody, say, starts on the day that the project starts and ends on the day? And
You can, sure, and that could, and you could default them and then let them change that value. Yeah, you can. Mm-hmm. Sure. Oops, sorry, we have one more question.
Continuous, because I guess it's all based on association, assigning an individual resource, many role, whether you're.
Yeah, that's what I thought Ethan was talking about. So we don't in our module. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, could you have an individual resource who supports multiple pools? And I thought that's the question Ethan was answering. Okay, so yeah, so you can associate multiple roles as child items and put a percentage in, let's say, that tells you how much of their time goes towards each of those pools. You wouldn't want to double count the person into two roles, right? Because they'd be double booked. But
just to clarify, a resource can be assigned to multiple roles.
Yeah, not in the sample, not in the example, but yes, for sure. Yep. And then you'd want to specify how much of their time probably goes to each one of those roles. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.